Just 5 minutes into my 30th birthday party, my own sister grabbed my custom cake, smashed it onto the marble floor, and looked me dead in the eye, telling me to pick it up and eat it like the pathetic nobody I was. I did not scream or cry, I simply walked out. That night, my mother sent me a text saying I was no longer part of the family. I replied with one sentence telling her I was removing my name from everything tomorrow. By the next morning, I had 97 missed calls, and my arrogant brother-in-law was facing federal charges. Before I tell you how I legally destroyed the people who thought they could walk all over me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach toxic family members a lesson they will never forget. The evening started as a hollow obligation. I had driven my modest sedan up the winding driveway of the massive Chicago suburban estate, where my older sister Sydney lived with her husband Spencer. To the outside world, Sydney and Spencer were the ultimate power couple. Spencer was the hotshot executive at a wealth management and logistics firm, and Sydney was his perfect trophy wife who spent her days organizing charity galas and redecorating rooms that did not need to be redecorated. They lived in a sprawling mansion with soaring ceilings, imported marble floors, and a perfectly manicured lawn. I was just Morgan, the quiet younger sister who worked as an accountant and supposedly struggled to make ends meet. That was the narrative they loved, and I let them believe it. I walked into the grand foyer holding a beautiful artisanal vanilla bean cake that I had ordered weeks in advance. It was my 30th birthday, and foolishly I thought my family might set aside their usual hostility for one evening. The house was filled with Spencer and Sydney elite friends holding crystal champagne flutes and laughing too loudly. When I walked into the main living room, the music died down slightly. Sydney spotted me immediately. She was wearing a silk designer dress that cost more than my supposed monthly salary. She did not say happy birthday. She did not even say hello. Instead, her eyes darted to the cake box in my hands, and her perfectly contoured face twisted into a sneer of absolute disgust. "Look who finally decided to show up," she announced, her voice cutting through the chatter of the room. "I see you brought your own cheap dessert. Morgan, could you not afford to chip in for the caterer like a normal person, or is that little bookkeeping job of yours really paying that badly?" I took a deep breath, keeping my expression neutral. "It is my birthday cake, Sydney. I ordered it for tonight. I thought we were celebrating together." "Celebrating together," she scoffed, stepping closer to me. The heavy scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. "You are 30 years old, Morgan. You are single, you live in a tiny apartment, and you punch numbers into a calculator all day for a living. What exactly is there to celebrate? Your mediocrity." Before I could respond, Spencer strolled over. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, a condescending smile plastered across his face. Spencer was the kind of man who loved to remind everyone of his wealth and his supposed superiority. As a white man who had married into our black family, he constantly tried to assert his dominance, masking his arrogance as business savvy. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder patronizingly. "Now, Sydney, let us not be too hard on Morgan," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Not everyone is built for success. The world needs people to do the grunt work right. Besides, it is nice of her to bring a little grocery store cake to our beautiful home. It adds a certain rustic charm to the evening, even if it completely clashes with the aesthetic." "It is not from a grocery store," I said calmly. Sydney snatched the box right out of my hands. She opened the lid and stared at the elegant frosting work. A look of pure jealousy flashed in her eyes, because it was objectively stunning. But Sydney could never allow me to have anything nice. She could never allow me to be the center of attention even on my own birthday. "This is pathetic," she hissed. "You come into my house, the house that my husband bought with his hard-earned money, and you try to make this night about you. You always do this, Morgan. You always bring your cheap energy into our space." Then, without a second of hesitation, Sydney flipped the box upside down. The heavy cake dropped with a sickening thud against the flawless white marble floor. The vanilla buttercreams splattered across the stone, the delicate decorations completely ruined. A collective gasp rippled through the room from the guests who were watching the spectacle. I stood frozen, staring at the ruined cake at my feet. The silence in the living room was deafening. I looked up at Sydney, expecting to see a flash of regret, or at least embarrassment for making a scene in front of her high society friends. Instead, she was smiling. It was a cold, calculated smile meant to break me. "Pick it up," she demanded, crossing her arms. I stared at her. "Excuse me." I said, "Pick it up and eat it, Morgan. You bought it, so do not let it go to waste. Get down on the floor and clean up the mess you made in my house. It is the least you can do since you contribute absolutely nothing to this family." Spencer chuckled, taking another sip of his drink. "You heard her, Morgan. Sydney runs a tight ship here. We cannot have frosting ruining the imported Italian marble. You know how much these floors cost, right? Oh wait, you are just an accountant. You probably do not see numbers this big in an entire year. The absolute disrespect, the sheer audacity of them standing there and humiliating me in front of dozens of strangers was the final push I needed. For years I had played the role of the quiet, struggling sister. I had endured their insults, their snide remarks, and their constant belittling. I had let them build their egos by stepping on my back. But looking at the smashed cake on the floor, something inside me clicked. The era of playing small was over. They had no idea who they were actually talking to. They had no idea that the pathetic accountant was actually the founder and CEO of a private equity firm that managed hundreds of millions of dollars. They did not know that I could buy their entire lives with a single phone call. I did not yell. I did not bend down to clean it up. I simply looked Sydney dead in the eye and let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I stepped back away from the mess, away from her, and away from the facade I had maintained for so long. I turned around and walked toward the heavy oak front doors, leaving the cake, the party, and their toxic delusions behind me. The true celebration was just about to begin. I had barely made it halfway across the expansive foyer when the sharp clicking of heels echoed from the grand staircase. It was our mother Evelyn descending with all the forced grace of a church matriarch who believed she was royalty. She was dressed in a tailored emerald suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, and her expression already set in a deep scowl. She stopped 2 steps from the bottom, her eyes landing on the ruined vanilla buttercream smeared across the pristine white marble. For a normal mother, this would be a moment to ask what happened. A normal mother might see her eldest daughter standing over her youngest daughter with a cruel smirk and realize who was at fault. But Evelyn was not a normal mother. She had spent her entire life rewriting reality to fit a narrative where Sydney was a flawless angel, and I was the bitter disappointment who constantly needed to be managed. She gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest. She did not ask Sydney why she had thrown a heavy cake onto her own floor. She did not ask Spencer why he was laughing. Her eyes locked onto me, and the familiar coldness I had known since childhood settled over her face. "Morgan, what is wrong with you?" She snapped, her voice echoing through the silent room. "Why must you always ruin the vibe the moment you step foot in this house? Cannot you go one evening without throwing a tantrum and trying to destroy your sister's beautiful home?" I stopped walking and slowly turned around to face her. The sheer absurdity of her accusation was staggering, but it was also entirely predictable. I watched as Sydney immediately dropped her arrogant smirk and shifted into her favorite role of the victim. Sydney let her shoulders slump and looked at our mother with wide, innocent eyes, claiming that I had dropped the cake on purpose because I was jealous of her new furniture. It was a lie so transparent a child could have seen through it, but Evelyn swallowed it whole. "Of course she is jealous," Evelyn said, glaring at me with absolute contempt. "She has always been jealous. You invite her into your gorgeous home out of the goodness of your heart, and this is how she repays you, by throwing her cheap little bakery items on the floor like a spoiled toddler." I stood there listening to the woman who gave birth to me completely invent a version of reality that justified her cruelty. This was her specialty. It was a psychological game she had played for decades. If Sydney failed a class, it was because I had distracted her. If Sydney wrecked a car, it was because I had stressed her out. And now Sydney had physically destroyed my birthday cake, but somehow, I was the one throwing a tantrum. Spencer walked over and placed a comforting arm around Sydney, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head. He looked at Evelyn and sighed, shaking his head as if he was the weary patriarch dealing with an unruly child. "We tried to be welcoming, Evelyn," he said smoothly. "We really did. We just wanted her to feel included for once, but you know how Morgan gets when she sees people doing better than her. She just cannot handle the fact that Sydney has built a real life while she is still figuring out how to balance a basic checkbook." Evelyn nodded vigorously, agreeing with the white son-in-law she worshipped like a deity. She took a step toward me, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. "You need to pray for the bitterness in your soul, Morgan," she told me, her tone dripping with self-righteous authority. "You are 30 years old today, and look at yourself. You have no husband, you have no real career, and you carry this toxic negative energy wherever you go. You should be down on your hands and knees thanking Spencer and Sydney for even allowing you in their presence. Instead, you act like a savage. Get down right now and clean up this mess before the grease ruins the stone." The guests were watching us in absolute silence. Some looked uncomfortable while others watched with morbid fascination. I looked at the three of them standing together, unified in their delusion. Sydney with her fake vulnerability, Spencer with his smug white savior complex, and my mother, the ultimate enabler who would gladly sacrifice my sanity to protect her golden child. For years I would have argued. I would have cried and tried to explain that Sydney snatched the box from my hands. I would have begged my mother to just look at the situation logically. But in that moment I felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of clarity. The heavy weight of seeking their approval simply evaporated from my shoulders. There was no magic combination of words that would ever make them see my worth. They did not want to see my worth because my supposed failure was the foundation upon which they built their own fragile egos. "I am not cleaning up anything," I said, my voice steady and dangerously quiet. Evelyn's face contorted with rage. Her eyes widened and she took another step forward. "Do not you dare use that tone with me in this house," she hissed. "You will respect your sister and you will respect her husband. If you walk out that door without cleaning up the mess you made, you are done. Do you hear me, Morgan? You are done. I will not have a daughter who acts like a jealous street rat in front of decent people." She expected me to freeze. She expected me to crumble under the threat of her abandonment because that was the weapon she had used to control me my entire life. But she did not realize that being abandoned by them was no longer a punishment. It was a liberation. I looked at Evelyn and let a soft, genuine smile touch my lips. It was the first real smile I had worn all evening. Then I turned my back on her. I heard her gasp in shock as I walked the rest of the way to the front door. Sydney yelled something nasty about my outfit, and Spencer told them to just let the trash take itself out. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the cool evening air. I walked down the grand driveway toward my modest sedan, the crunch of the gravel beneath my shoes sounding like applause. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the mansion without looking in the rearview mirror even once. That night, I sat in the living room of my actual home, a sprawling luxury penthouse in the heart of downtown Chicago that my family knew nothing about. I poured myself a glass of aged bourbon and watched the city lights glittering below. My phone buzzed on the kitchen island. It was a text message from Evelyn. It read exactly as she had promised. "We are done. You are not part of this family." I picked up the phone. I did not type out an angry paragraph. I did not try to defend myself. I simply typed one sentence. "I am removing my name from everything tomorrow." I hit send. Then I opened my laptop and began making the financial moves that would completely dismantle the fake empire Spencer and Sydney had built on my dime. I opened my laptop and began the process. For 5 years, I had been the silent architect of their wealth. When Spencer first wanted to start his wealth management and logistics firm, he had absolutely nothing. He had a failed startup under his belt and a credit score that made banks laugh in his face. Sydney was devastated because she desperately wanted the lifestyle of a corporate wife. That was when my mother Evelyn came to my tiny apartment crying and begging. She told me that family helps family. She told me that God would bless me if I used my pristine credit to co-sign a loan for Spencer. She assumed I was just a diligent accountant who saved her pennies. She had no idea that I had already launched my private equity firm and amassed a quiet fortune. I agreed to sign the paperwork as a financial guarantor for his $2.5 million commercial loan. I did it because I was foolish enough to believe that my sacrifice would finally earn me a place at their table. I believed it would make my mother love me. Instead, it only made them resent me more. Every time they looked at me, they secretly knew they owed their entire existence to the sister they deemed inferior. To cope with that blow to his white savior ego, Spencer treated me like dirt, and Sydney joined right in. But that era ended tonight. I picked up my phone and dialed the private 24-hour concierge line for my wealth management team at the bank. When you control the kind of capital I do, there is always someone awake to answer your call. A representative named David answered on the second ring. I kept my voice perfectly level and told him I needed to execute an immediate revocation of my guarantor status on the corporate accounts for Spencer. David paused and gently reminded me that pulling my backing would instantly trigger a default clause. He explained that the bank would immediately freeze all of the business accounts to protect their assets. I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, looking at the empty city streets below. I told David that I was fully aware of the consequences and authorized the action immediately. I listened to the clicking of his keyboard through the receiver. Within 10 minutes, he confirmed that the digital paperwork was filed. The financial safety net was gone. But I was not finished yet. Sydney had been living a life of absolute luxury, charging thousands of dollars a week on a black card. She believed the card was linked to a trust fund that Spencer had set up for her. In reality, it was an authorized user card linked directly to one of my private accounts. I had set it up years ago through a blind trust, just to keep peace in the family, because Evelyn constantly complained that Spencer was too stressed about money. I logged into my banking portal, navigated to the Authorized Users tab, and found the account for Sydney. I clicked the button to revoke access and watched the status change to permanently deactivated. I felt a physical weight lift from my chest as the screen refreshed. I was no longer funding my own abuse. I closed my laptop and poured myself another glass of water. I did not go to sleep. I was too energized by the sheer liberation of severing those toxic ties. I sat on my velvet sofa and watched the dark sky slowly turn into a bruised purple, and then a brilliant morning gold. The sun rose over the Chicago skyline, casting a warm glow across my living room. For the first time in my life, I felt completely safe. I was not bracing for an insulting text message from my sister. I was not dreading a manipulative phone call from my mother. I was untouchable. I took a long hot shower and dressed in a comfortable cashmere lounge set. I made myself a cup of premium black coffee and sat at my kitchen island. I knew exactly what was coming. At exactly 8:15 in the morning, the absolute silence of my penthouse was broken. My phone, which was resting on the marble counter, began to vibrate. The screen illuminated, displaying the caller ID for Spencer. I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched it ring until it went to voicemail. Less than 30 seconds later, it rang again. And then again. I did not move to silence it. I just watched it dance across the stone counter. By 9 o'clock, the situation had escalated into pure digital chaos. My screen was a constant stream of notifications. When I finally picked it up to check the damage, I had exactly 97 missed calls. 42 of those calls were from Spencer, 30 were from Sydney, 25 were from Evelyn. The text messages were even more frantic. I scrolled through them, reading the panic in real time. The first message from Spencer arrived at 8 in the morning, demanding to know if I had touched the banking portal, because his corporate accounts were showing a locked status. By 8:30, his messages had shifted from annoyed to frantic. He was at a business breakfast, and his corporate card had been declined in front of clients. He demanded I call the bank and fix whatever clerical error I had caused. He still believed he was in control. He still thought this was just a mistake. The messages from Sydney started around 8:45. She was entirely focused on her own vanity. She typed in all capital letters screaming that she was at her favorite luxury boutique and her black card had been confiscated by the cashier. She accused me of hacking her accounts out of spite because of the cake incident. She threatened to call the police and have me arrested for financial fraud. Then came the messages from Evelyn. They were a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She started by commanding me to answer the phone and stop acting like a petulant child. When I did not respond, her tone shifted to guilt. She told me I was stressing my sister out and ruining a very important business day for Spencer. She demanded I come to the mansion immediately to apologize and fix the bank issue before she gathered the entire extended family and the church pastor to formally excommunicate me. They were all unraveling. The luxurious fortress they had built was crumbling around them, and they had not even realized yet that I was the one holding the sledgehammer. They still viewed me as the weak, pathetic accountant who could be bullied into submission. They thought they could summon me like a disobedient servant. I set my phone face down on the counter and finished my coffee. I decided to let them sweat for a few more hours before I delivered the next blow. I got dressed for the day, selecting a tailored charcoal gray suit that cost more than Spencer made in an entire month. I took the private elevator down to the underground garage, where my driver was already waiting with the door of my black town car open. As we navigated through the bustling morning traffic of downtown Chicago, I watched the city wake up through the tinted windows. I was not heading to a cramped cubicle in a mid-level accounting firm like my family believed. My driver pulled up to the entrance of a towering glass skyscraper located right in the heart of the prestigious financial district. I walked through the revolving doors and the security guards immediately straightened their posture, nodding respectfully as I passed by. I bypassed the crowded main lobby and stepped into the private executive elevator, swiping my secure access card to reach the top floor. When the polished metal doors slid open, I stepped into the expansive reception area of the private equity firm I had built entirely from the ground up. My firm managed a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars, acquiring struggling logistics companies and turning them around for massive profit. The sleek minimalist office was a hive of quiet intensity, with brilliant analysts and aggressive portfolio managers analyzing global markets. As I walked down the long glass-walled corridor, my employees offered brief, respectful morning greetings. They knew me as a ruthless but incredibly fair chief executive officer who never let emotions cloud her professional judgment. If only my family could see the way real professionals treated me on a daily basis. I entered my private corner office, dropping my heavy leather briefcase onto the massive custom mahogany desk. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, uninterrupted view of the entire city skyline. My assistant entered quietly, placing a perfectly brewed macchiato on a stone coaster next to my keyboard, along with a thick stack of morning financial briefings. I thanked him and sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, soaking in the absolute control I had over my environment. For years, Spencer had paraded around our family gatherings in his expensive tailored suits, acting like he was the sole provider of wealth and status. He soaked up my mother relentless praise while treating me like an annoying charity case who was lucky to breathe the same air as him. He never realized that the only reason he could afford those suits or the imported marble floors that Sydney loved so much was because I permitted it. My signature on that original guarantor document was the only thing standing between him and total financial bankruptcy. When I bought out my first major competitor at 26, I learned that true power does not need to loudly announce itself. True power sits in complete silence and waits for the perfect moment to strike. My phone began to vibrate against the polished wood of my desk, shattering the quiet elegance of my office. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was Spencer again. Call number 98. I decided he had suffered enough alone in the dark. I reached out and tapped the green button, answering the call and placing him on speakerphone so his frantic voice could echo in the large, empty room. "Morgan, what the hell is wrong with you?" Spencer barked instantly, his voice tight with an ugly mixture of sheer panic and deep rage. "I have been calling you all morning. Are you completely out of your mind? Do you have any idea what kind of mess you just caused at the bank?" I leaned back in my chair, picking up my warm coffee. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich espresso before I even bothered to answer him. "Good morning, Spencer," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I trust you are having an eventful Tuesday so far." "Do not play games with me, you stupid little girl," he snarled, dropping any leftover pretense of being the charming white savior brother-in-law. I was at a crucial breakfast meeting with two major investors, and my corporate card was declined in front of everyone. The bank teller just told me the accounts are frozen because the primary guarantor requested a sudden withdrawal of backing. "I know you were upset about the stupid cake last night, but logging into the banking portal and messing with things you do not understand is a literal federal offense. You probably clicked the wrong button while you were throwing your little pity party in your cheap apartment." His arrogance was truly boundless and almost comical. Even when faced with the direct catastrophic consequences of my actions, he still assumed I was just a bumbling emotional woman who did not understand high finance. He truly believed he was the only capable adult in the room. "I did not click the wrong button, Spencer," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, chilling register that commanded the room. "I called my private wealth manager at midnight and explicitly instructed him to sever my financial backing from your failing logistics company. You are officially operating without a safety net as of this morning." There was a brief, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear his ragged breathing as his brain frantically tried to process the reality of the situation. Then he let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. "You called your private wealth manager?" He mocked, his tone dripping with absolute venom. "Morgan, you are a low-level bookkeeper. You do not have a private wealth manager. You do not have the authority to unilaterally freeze a $2.5 million account without a 30-day legal notice. You do not have the power to do anything to me. I am the chief executive officer of a major company, and you are a nobody. I am going to have my legal team draft a massive lawsuit that will take your little apartment, your car, and every pathetic dime you have ever managed to save." I listened to his ridiculous threats without a single spike in my heart rate. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that his supposed major company was bleeding capital and surviving solely because my pristine financial standing was keeping his creditors at bay. He thought his lawyers could scare me into submission. He did not know that I had an entire team of ruthless corporate attorneys on retainer who ate weak men like him for breakfast. "You are welcome to try, Spencer," I replied smoothly, spinning a heavy silver pen between my fingers. "But before you call your imaginary legal team, I highly suggest you check your corporate email inbox. You should have received a formal declaration of withdrawal at exactly 8 in the morning. The bank has already initiated a full forensic audit of your business accounts due to the sudden lack of collateral." "Listen to me, you ungrateful witch!" he yelled, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the deep terror hiding right beneath his blind aggression. "Your mother is sick to her stomach over this nonsense. Sydney is crying her eyes out because her cards are declining everywhere she goes. We gave you everything. We let you into our beautiful home. If you do not call the bank right now and fix this mistake, I will personally make sure you never show your face in this city again. You will be completely dead to this family." I smiled, looking out at the sprawling city below me. "That is the entire point, Spencer," I said softly. "I am already dead to you. Now you finally get to see what real life is like without my ghost secretly paying all your bills." I reached out and ended the call, cutting off his frantic screaming mid-sentence. The office was blissfully quiet once again. I finished my coffee, opened my laptop, and pulled up the detailed investigative dossier my analysts had compiled on his highly fraudulent business practices. The financial freeze today was just the opening warning shot. The real destruction was yet to come. I sat back in my leather chair and watched the digital clock on my desk tick forward. The wheels of institutional finance turn with absolute ruthlessness when millions of dollars are suddenly left unsecured. My private line rang. It was David, my wealth manager from Chase Bank. He spoke in the hushed, professional tone of a man delivering highly confidential and highly entertaining information. David knew exactly who I was, and the sheer volume of capital I controlled meant he was more than happy to give me a front row seat to the chaos I had just unleashed. He told me that Spencer had practically kicked down the doors of the downtown branch just moments ago. According to David, Spencer marched straight past the tellers and demanded an emergency meeting with the branch manager, screaming about clerical errors and threatening to pull his non-existent wealth from their institution. The branch manager, an older gentleman who had dealt with thousands of fake millionaires, calmly invited Spencer into his office and pulled up the loan file. For the first time in 5 years, Spencer was forced to look at the cold, hard numbers without my pristine financial shadow protecting him. The manager explained that the $2.5 million commercial loan had a strict continuous guarantor clause. Because my withdrawal was legally executed at midnight, the system automatically locked everything. David painted a pathetic picture. He said Spencer tried to use his typical aggressive negotiation tactics, puffing out his chest and demanding a temporary bridge loan to cover his operating costs for the week. The manager simply turned the computer monitor around and showed Spencer his actual credit score and his highly leveraged debt-to-income ratio. Without my backing, Spencer was not a hotshot executive. He was a severe liability. The bank told him they would not authorize a single penny of credit and that his current outstanding balances were being called in for immediate repayment. David mentioned that Spencer literally turned pale, his confident posture deflating completely as the reality of his total financial vulnerability washed over him. I thanked David for the update and ended the call feeling a profound sense of justice. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had calculated. A logistics and wealth management firm cannot survive for a single day without liquid capital. My firm had been monitoring his business operations for months, and I knew exactly how fragile his cash flow was. Within the hour, my industry contacts began sending me quiet messages. The ripple effects of the frozen accounts were hitting his company in real time. Vendors who supplied his shipping fleet were experiencing bounced electronic payments. 2 of his major freight contracts were halted because the automated insurance premiums attached to the Chase accounts had failed to process. Spencer had built an illusion of success entirely on the backs of unpaid invoices and rolling debt, hoping that his association with my good name would keep the house of cards standing. Now the wind was blowing and he had nowhere to hide. My assistant brought in my lunch and I ate it while reading the live updates of his corporate collapse. Around noon, the desperation started to bleed into my personal messages again. Spencer had stopped calling, but the tone of his text messages had drastically shifted. The aggressive legal threats were gone. Now he was trying to negotiate. He sent a long paragraph explaining that payroll was due on Friday, and if the accounts remained frozen, the employees would not get paid. He tried to guilt-trip me, using the livelihoods of innocent workers to manipulate my conscience. He said we could figure this out privately and that he was willing to formally apologize for the cake incident if I would just reinstate the guarantee by the end of the business day. It was a pathetic display of cowardice. When he thought he held all the power, he was more than happy to publicly humiliate me and mock my career. Staring down the barrel of corporate bankruptcy, he was suddenly eager to play the role of a reasonable family man, trying to keep the peace. He wanted to trade a fake apology for $2.5 million of risk. I did not respond. I just let the silence stretch out, allowing his panic to marinate. He did not know that his attempt to use his employees against me was completely useless. My private equity firm had already prepared an acquisition strategy. I had no intention of letting the workers suffer for his incompetence. Once the bank officially pushed his firm into receivership, I planned to buy the viable assets for pennies on the dollar and restructure the company under new competent leadership. Spencer would be completely removed from the equation. He was not a businessman trying to save his staff. He was a parasite trying to save his own ego. The afternoon dragged on, and the silence from my end only amplified the terror on his. He tried reaching out to other lenders to secure high-interest loans, but the financial world is incredibly small and news travels fast. Once Chase Bank placed a hard freeze on his assets, other institutions immediately flagged his tax ID. Nobody was going to touch him. He was effectively blacklisted from every major lending firm in the city. The wealthy facade he had spent years carefully constructing for my mother and his country club friends was rapidly evaporating. As I finished reviewing the final legal documents for the day, I knew that Spencer had exhausted every possible professional lifeline. He was trapped, and because he was a weak man, he was bound to take his frustration out on the people closest to him. The financial stress was going to strip away their polite country club manners and expose the rot underneath. I smiled softly as I closed my silver laptop. The real show was truly just beginning, and I could hardly wait anymore. I did not have to wait long for the next act of the circus to begin. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a preliminary prospectus for a new corporate acquisition when my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished mahogany surface. I glanced at the glowing screen and saw my sister name flashing urgently. It was exactly 2 in the afternoon, which was typically the time Sydney spent aggressively shopping on the Magnificent Mile using the platinum black card she thought her wealthy husband provided for her. I reached out and tapped the screen, answering the call and placing the phone on speaker. Before I could even say hello, a shrill, hysterical scream erupted from the tiny speaker. "Morgan, what the hell did you do to my accounts?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls of my private office. I could hear the unmistakable ambient noise of a luxury retail store in the background. There was the soft classical music playing over the ceiling speakers and the hushed whispers of highly trained sales associates. Sydney was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as if she had just run a marathon. "I am standing at the checkout counter at the Chanel boutique," she sobbed, her voice cracking with absolute humiliation. "I just tried to buy the limited edition quilted lambskin bag, and my black card was declined." The machine literally beeped loudly, and the screen said the account was permanently closed. The cashier looked at me like I was some kind of street beggar trying to steal from them. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for me? My friends are standing right here watching me get humiliated by a retail worker who makes minimum wage. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, resting my hands quietly on my lap. "That sounds like a terribly inconvenient experience, Sydney," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "Perhaps you should ask your incredibly wealthy and successful husband to transfer some emergency funds into your checking account so you can pay with your own debit card like a normal person." My calm tone only seemed to ignite her rage further. "You evil little witch!" she screamed, completely abandoning her carefully crafted high society persona in the middle of a public store. "I know you did this. I know you hacked into the banking portal because you are bitter and jealous about last night. You are so pathetic, Morgan. It was just a joke. I dropped your stupid cheap cake on the floor as a simple joke to lighten the mood, and you are throwing a massive childish tantrum just like you always do. You ruin everything for everyone. You are actually committing a federal felony right now out of sheer spite. You used your boring little accounting skills to hack into Spencer Private Family Trust Fund and lock me out of my own money. You are completely sick in the head and you need serious psychiatric help." Her ability to gaslight me was truly impressive and deeply disturbing. Even while standing at the center of a massive public humiliation, she still tried to rewrite reality to make me the ultimate villain of her story. She truly believed that my career consisted of resetting passwords and balancing basic spreadsheets in a cubicle. She thought her husband was a financial titan who conquered the corporate world, and I was just a petty cybercriminal trying to ruin her Tuesday afternoon shopping spree. I let her rant and scream for another full minute, listening closely as the boutique manager politely asked her to lower her voice so she would not disturb the other wealthy patrons in the store. I could hear the sheer panic in Sydney's voice as she tried to shoo the manager away, demanding that they run the heavy metal card one more time because there was an obvious mistake. When she finally ran out of breath and stopped yelling, I leaned forward and spoke directly into the microphone. Sydney. I did not hack into anything, I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that cut straight through her hysteria. I simply logged into my own private banking portal and removed you as an authorized user. There was a sudden heavy silence on the other end of the line. The only sound was the soft classical music playing in the background of the boutique and the nervous shuffling of feet. "What are you talking about?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound confusion and deep terror. "That is Spencer money. That card is linked to the exclusive trust fund he set up for me when we got married. He gave me that card." I let out a soft, humorless laugh that echoed in my large office. "Spencer does not have a trust fund, Sydney. Spencer barely has a positive net worth. That black card you have been using to buy your designer bags and your expensive lunches for the last 5 years is linked directly to a blind trust that I created and funded with my own money. I am the sole owner of that account. I am the one who pays the massive statement balance in full every single month. I allowed you to use my wealth because our mother came to me crying and begged me to keep peace in the family, since your husband was secretly drowning in corporate debt. But after watching you destroy my birthday cake on the floor of a house that you technically do not even own, I decided my hidden charity work was officially over." "You are lying," she screamed, her panic reaching an absolute fever pitch as the walls of her fake reality began to cave in. "You do not have that kind of money. You are just a broke, pathetic accountant who lives in a tiny, miserable apartment. I am calling the police right now. I am going to tell them that you committed massive financial fraud and identity theft. You are going to go to federal prison, Morgan. I will make sure they lock you up for destroying my life and stealing from my husband." I smiled, staring out at the beautiful sunlit Chicago skyline. "Please do call the police, Sydney," I replied smoothly without a single ounce of fear. "Call the police and demand that they arrest your younger sister for refusing to buy you a Chanel handbag. I am sure the responding officers will be absolutely thrilled to take that official report. Tell them exactly how you have been spending my hard-earned money for 5 years while treating me like absolute garbage. While you are at it, you should probably call Spencer and ask him why his business accounts were also permanently frozen this morning. Then you can both sit in the dark in your empty house and figure out how you are going to pay your mortgage next month." Before she could utter another hysterical, threatening word, I reached out and ended the call. I placed my phone face down on the desk and took a deep, cleansing breath. The illusion she had lived in for her entire adult life was finally shattered into a million unfixable pieces. I knew she was currently standing in the middle of a high-end boutique sobbing hysterically while her wealthy fake friends backed away from her in absolute disgust. The sales associates were probably calling store security right at that moment to physically escort her off the premises. The fake royal family of our suburban town was rapidly descending into total poverty and public disgrace. And my mother, the woman who had orchestrated this entire toxic dynamic from the very beginning, was the next person on my list. I did not even have to wait 10 minutes before my phone lit up again. This time, the caller ID displayed the name of the final boss in this twisted family game. It was my mother, Evelyn. She was a woman who wielded her position on the church elder board like a loaded weapon. To the congregation, she was a beacon of Christian charity and maternal wisdom. To me, she was the architect of my childhood misery. I knew exactly what strategy she would use. While Spencer used aggressive threats and Sydney used hysterical gaslighting, my mother preferred the slow, suffocating poison of religious guilt and public shame. I let the phone ring 4 times before I finally picked it up. "Morgan." She began, her voice heavy with a manufactured exhaustion that she had perfected over decades of playing the martyr. "I have been on the phone with your sister for the past hour trying to calm her down. She is completely heartbroken. Spencer is pacing the floors of their home, trying to figure out how to save his employees from starvation because of whatever childish game you are playing with their bank accounts. I raised you to be a lot of things, but I never thought I raised a thief and a saboteur." I listened to her weave her lies without a single flinch. The audacity to call me a thief when they had been draining my resources for years was almost poetic. I did not interrupt her. I knew she needed to complete her monologue because narcissists always need to set the stage before they deliver their demands. The Lord sees everything you are doing, Morgan. She continued, her tone dropping into a threatening pastoral cadence. You are letting the devil use your jealousy to destroy this family. Sydney is a good wife, and you are attacking her out of pure spite because you are unhappy with your own empty life. Do you have any idea how this looks for us? Do you know what the congregation will think when they hear you are trying to bankrupt your own brother-in-law? You are bringing shame to my name, and I will not stand for it. She cared about the congregation. She did not care about the truth. She did not care that Spencer was a massive fraud, or that Sydney had publicly humiliated me the night before. She only cared about the pristine image of her perfect suburban family and how her country club friends perceived her. I'm not playing a game, Mother, I said softly, leaning back in my executive chair. I simply stopped paying for their lifestyle. If Spencer is the brilliant businessman you always claim he is, he should have no problem securing a new line of credit by the end of the day. Do not get smart with me. She snapped, the holy matriarch facade cracking just a fraction to reveal the vicious enabler underneath. You do not understand how corporate finance works. Spencer told me you pressed the wrong button and triggered a security freeze. But Sydney thinks you did it on purpose to be vindictive. Either way, you are going to fix it right now. I have already called your Uncle George, your Aunt Linda, and Pastor Thomas. They are all coming over to the house tonight at 6. We are having a formal family meeting. You are going to walk through those front doors, you are going to apologize to your sister, and you are going to call the bank to reverse whatever mess you made. The threat was abundantly clear. She was organizing a public tribunal. In our community, having the extended family and the church pastor called to your home for a behavioral intervention was the ultimate social execution. It was designed to break your spirit through collective shaming and peer pressure. She expected me to cower at the thought of facing Pastor Thomas and Aunt Linda. She expected me to beg for forgiveness to avoid being officially ostracized from the only community I had ever known. This was how she kept everyone in line for 30 years. If you do not show up tonight and fix this, Evelyn warned, her voice icy and absolute, I will make sure every single person in this city knows what you did. I will stand up at the pulpit this Sunday and tell the entire congregation that my youngest daughter has lost her mind and attacked her own flesh and blood. You will have no family. You will have no community. You will be entirely alone, Morgan. Think very carefully about your next move, because I am not playing with you. I looked down at the thick stack of financial documents sitting on my mahogany desk. I looked at the forensic audit of Spencer Fake Logistics Company that detailed his massive wire frauds. I looked at the original property deed for the suburban mansion they were currently standing inside, which was printed on heavy watermarked paper and legally signed with my corporate entity name. Evelyn thought she was cornering a frightened animal. She had absolutely no idea she was inviting an apex predator straight into her living room. I will be there, I said, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any emotion. I will be there at 6 o'clock sharp, Mother. Please make sure everyone is present. I would hate for anyone to miss what I have to say to the family. Evelyn let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, assuming she had successfully bullied me into submission like she always did. Good, she said firmly. Bring your laptop so you can log into the bank and fix this in front of everyone. And you better come with a humble heart, Morgan. We will be waiting for you. She ended the call. I sat in my silent office and smiled a genuine predatory smile. I did not need to bring my laptop. Everything I needed to permanently dismantle their lives was already printed and waiting in the sleek black leather briefcase resting beside my desk. I spent the next few hours wrapping up my actual corporate duties, signing off on a major logistics acquisition, and reviewing my private equity investment portfolios. When 5 o'clock finally rolled around, I stood up and smoothed out the wrinkles in my expensive tailored charcoal suit. I walked over to the corner of the room and picked up the heavy black briefcase, feeling the immense weight of the irrefutable evidence inside. I walked out of my executive office and took the private elevator down to my waiting town car. It was time to go back to the suburbs. It was time to attend the family meeting and burn their false kingdom straight to the ground. The drive back to the sprawling suburban estate was quiet and steady. I sat in the back of my town car watching the landscape change from the towering glass structures of the financial district to the manicured lawns and gated driveways of the wealthy elite. When my driver pulled up to the familiar massive house, the circular driveway was already packed with vehicles. I recognized my Uncle George heavy-duty truck, my Aunt Linda pristine luxury sedan, and the modest sensible car belonging to Pastor Thomas. They had all gathered exactly as instructed to witness my formal excommunication. I instructed my driver to wait for me right by the curb because I knew I would not be staying long. I stepped out into the cool evening air, gripping the leather handle of my black briefcase. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed open the heavy front doors without knocking. The house was quiet, but a heavy tension hung in the air. I made my way down the hallway toward the formal living room. Before I even crossed the threshold, I could hear the trembling theatrical voice of my mother echoing off the high ceilings. She was already deep into her performance. I stood quietly in the shadow of the hallway just out of sight to listen to the narrative she was spinning. Evelyn was sitting in the center of the plush velvet sofa, dabbing at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Pastor Thomas sat in a high-backed armchair, leaning forward with a look of deep pastoral concern. My Aunt Linda and Uncle George were perched on the love seat, shaking their heads in synchronized disappointment, and there in the corner stood Sydney and Spencer. Sydney was makeup-free, her hair deliberately messy, to look like a woman who had spent the entire day crying in terror. Spencer stood behind her, with his hands resting protectively on her shoulders, playing the role of the stoic, besieged patriarch. I just do not understand where all this hatred comes from. Evelyn sobbed, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. We have given Morgan everything. We have loved her and supported her, even when she chose to live such a small, unremarkable life. But she has always carried this dark, heavy jealousy in her heart. She cannot stand to see her sister happy. She cannot stand to see a successful, driven man like Spencer providing such a beautiful life for Sydney. Pastor Thomas nodded slowly, resting his hands on his open Bible. Jealousy is a dangerous poison, Sister Evelyn, he murmured in his deep, comforting tone. It blinds the spirit and turns family members into strangers. It is worse than jealousy. Pastor Evelyn continued, her voice rising in pitch to ensure the entire room felt the weight of her fake pain. Last night we tried to include her in our family celebration. We bought her a beautiful cake. We welcomed her into this gorgeous home. And what did she do? She threw a massive tantrum. She threw her own birthday cake on the imported marble floor, just to humiliate Sydney in front of important business guests. And when I asked her to simply clean it up, she stormed out and decided to destroy my son-in-law career. Aunt Linda gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. She destroyed his career, she asked in a hushed, dramatic whisper. I always knew Morgan was a difficult child. But this is pure evil, Linda added, looking toward Spencer with deep sympathy. Spencer stepped forward, looking exhausted and deeply troubled. He sighed, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. I really did not want to bring the family into this. He lied smoothly, his voice dripping with fake reluctance. But yes, Linda. Morgan used her accounting background to illegally access my corporate banking portal. She triggered a massive security freeze on all my business accounts today. She froze my payroll. She is actively trying to starve my employees and bankrupt my company just because she is angry that I defended my wife last night. I could have her arrested for cybercrimes today, but I held off because I respect Evelyn too much to send her daughter to federal prison. The sheer audacity of his lies was breathtaking. He was painting himself as a merciful white savior who was sparing a bitter, jealous black woman from the legal consequences of her own petty crimes. He was using his race and his supposed corporate status to command absolute sympathy from my family, and they were eating out of the palm of his hand. They had always treated him like a trophy because he brought proximity to white wealth into our family dynamic. They worshipped the ground he walked on simply because he wore expensive suits and used corporate buzzwords. Uncle George slammed his fist down on his knee, his face turning red with anger. "That girl has lost her mind," he growled. "You cannot let her get away with this, Spencer. Family or not, she needs to face the consequences of messing with another man's livelihood. She has always been a bitter little thing, but trying to ruin a good man's business is crossing the line." Sydney let out a loud theatrical sob, burying her face in her hands. "She even canceled my credit cards, Uncle George," she cried, her voice muffled. "I was at the store today, trying to buy a simple gift for a charity event, and my card was declined in front of everyone. She is trying to financially ruin us so we lose this house. She wants us to be homeless just because she is miserable and lonely and cannot find a man of her own." Evelyn reached out and grabbed the pastor hand. "You have to talk to her, Pastor Thomas," she pleaded, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. "You have to make her see the evil she is committing. She needs to drop this vendetta, call the bank to restore the accounts, and beg for Spencer forgiveness before he loses everything he has worked so hard to build. Our family reputation is on the line, and Morgan is trying to drag us all down into the mud." I had heard enough. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was fully invested in the tragedy of the wealthy, benevolent couple and the evil, jealous sister. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the center of the living room, my black briefcase heavy in my hand. The moment they saw me, the room fell dead silent. Evelyn dropped her handkerchief. Sydney stopped fake crying instantly. Spencer stood a little straighter, his eyes darting nervously to the briefcase I was holding. Pastor Thomas offered me a tight, strained smile, clearly preparing to deliver a heavy sermon on repentance. I did not look at the pastor or my aunt and uncle. I looked directly at my mother, who was staring at me with a mixture of smug satisfaction and absolute authority. She thought she had won. She thought the presence of the church and the extended family would force me to fold, just like it always did when I was a child. She assumed the collective weight of their disappointment would crush my spirit. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice calm and echoing slightly in the large, silent room. "I hear we are discussing my jealousy and Spencer's massive corporate success. I brought some documents that might help clarify exactly how successful he really is." I walked over to the large glass coffee table in the center of the room and placed the black briefcase down with a heavy, solid thud. The sound made Spencer physically flinch. The tribunal was officially in session, and I was the one holding the gavel. The heavy thud of the briefcase on the glass coffee table seemed to paralyze the room for a brief moment. Evelyn was the first to recover her composure. She straightened her posture and gestured toward a solitary wooden chair positioned directly across from the velvet sofa. She told me to sit down and stop being so dramatic. She said I was acting like a foolish child trying to command a room filled with adults. I did not sit. I remained standing tall and perfectly still, keeping my hands resting lightly on the leather handle of my briefcase. Sydney let out an exasperated sigh and rolled her eyes. She uncrossed her arms and marched over to the coffee table, standing just inches away from me. She was holding a crisp piece of paper in her manicured hand. She looked me up and down with a sneer of absolute disgust, as if I was a stray animal that had wandered into her pristine home. She said they were all tired of my little temper tantrum and that they did not have time to play these childish games anymore. She raised her hand and violently threw the piece of paper right at my chest. It fluttered through the air and landed gently on top of my black briefcase. It was a personal check written out to me in the amount of $10,000. The signature at the bottom belonged to Spencer. Sydney crossed her arms again and lifted her chin triumphantly. She told me to take the money and consider it a generous parting gift from a family that had already tolerated me for way too long. She said $10,000 was probably more money than I had ever seen in my entire pathetic life. She demanded that I open my laptop right there on the coffee table, log into the banking portal, and reinstate the guarantor status for Spencer immediately. After I did that, she said I was to take the check, walk out the front door, and never contact them again. She told me to get out of their lives for good because I was a toxic stain on their perfect family image. She actually thought $10,000 was a flex. She thought she was buying my submission with a sum of money I typically spent on a weekend business trip. I stared down at the check, feeling a profound sense of pity for her deep delusion. Before I could even formulate a response, Spencer stepped up to stand beside his wife. He puffed out his chest, trying to physically intimidate me with his height. He looked down his nose at me, his face flushed with arrogant anger. He told me I better take the deal Sydney was offering because it was the only mercy I was going to get. He said he had already spoken to his corporate legal team earlier that afternoon. He claimed his lawyers charged $1,000 an hour and that they were currently drafting a massive lawsuit against me for tortious interference with a commercial business. He threatened to drag me through the court system until I was entirely bankrupt. He said his expensive lawyers would place a lien on my cheap little apartment, seize my 20-year-old car, and garnish my tiny accountant's salary for the rest of my miserable life. He told me I had no idea who I was messing with. He said he was a titan of industry, and I was just a sad, lonely woman trying to play a game I could not possibly win. I looked around the room, watching the reactions of my extended family. Uncle George nodded in firm agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. He muttered that I was incredibly lucky Spencer was willing to offer me a single dime after the stunt I pulled. Aunt Linda whispered to the pastor that Spencer was truly a Christian man for showing such grace to a troubled soul like me. Pastor Thomas cleared his throat and offered me a sad, disappointed look. He told me that pride comes before a fall and that I should accept this generous olive branch. He urged me to sign the bank papers, take the money, and spend some time in deep prayer to cleanse my heart of its wicked jealousy. They all truly believed they had cornered me. They thought this coordinated attack of financial bribery and legal threats would break my spirit and force me to submit to their will. Evelyn sat on the sofa watching me with a smug, satisfied smile playing on her lips. She thought she had orchestrated the perfect intervention. She thought she had successfully protected her golden child and her perfect white son-in-law while simultaneously banishing the family scapegoat. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to yell and defend myself so they could point their fingers and call me crazy. They wanted to feed off my emotional distress, because that was the currency they used to power their own fragile self-esteem. But I did not give them a single tear. I did not give them a single shout. I stood completely motionless in the center of the opulent living room, listening to their vile insults and their empty threats. I looked at the $10,000 check resting on my briefcase and felt absolutely nothing but cold, sharp clarity. The air in the room grew heavy as my continued silence stretched on. Sydney shifted uncomfortably on her feet. Spencer uncrossed his arms and clenched his jaw, clearly unnerved by the fact that I was not cowering in fear. Evelyn's smile began to falter just a fraction. They had fired all their best weapons. They had used guilt-shame bribery and intimidation, and none of it had left a single scratch on me. I was simply letting them talk, allowing them to dig their own graves with every arrogant word they spoke. I knew that the more they talked, the sweeter my revenge would taste when I finally opened my briefcase. Spencer noticed my lack of reaction, and his face grew even redder. He leaned forward, invading my personal space, trying to force me to look away. He said I was making the biggest mistake of my life by standing there in silence. He told me that when his legal team was finished with me, I would not even be able to get a job at a fast food restaurant because my background check would be flagged for financial crimes. He boasted about his powerful connections in the city, claiming he played golf with the district attorney and could easily have me locked in a holding cell by tomorrow morning if I did not comply immediately. He told me I was nothing but a minor inconvenience to a man of his stature, and that I should be grateful he was even taking the time to speak to me directly. Sydney chimed in again, her voice dripping with venom. She said I was always a stubborn loser who never knew when to give up. She pointed at the front door and told me that once I signed the papers and took the check, I was officially dead to her. She said she never wanted to see my face at another family holiday or birthday party ever again. She told me I was a disease that they were finally curing. I absorbed every single word. I locked away every insult and every threat in my mind, ensuring that I would feel absolutely no guilt for what I was about to do to them. The check on my briefcase sat there like a physical manifestation of their ignorance. They had no idea they were throwing a $10,000 bribe at a woman who could buy their entire neighborhood with liquid cash. They had no idea that the titan of industry standing before me was actually a desperate criminal teetering on the edge of federal indictment. The grand performance they had put on for the pastor and the extended family was reaching its climax, and they had delivered their lines perfectly. Now, it was almost my turn to speak. I looked at the piece of paper sitting on my briefcase and let the silence stretch. My refusal to react was driving them insane. Narcissists cannot handle a void. When they throw a punch, they desperately need you to bleed so they can feel powerful. Because I was giving them absolutely nothing, Evelyn decided she needed to escalate the attack. She stood up from the velvet sofa, her face twisting into a mask of pure maternal disappointment. She walked slowly toward me, shaking her head. "You have always been like this, Morgan," she said, her voice thick with fake sorrow. "Ever since you were a little girl, you had this dark cloud hanging over you. Do you remember when you were 10 and Sydney won the state spelling bee? You locked yourself in your room and refused to come out to celebrate her. You ruined her special day just like you are trying to ruin her life now. You have this sickness in your brain that makes you rewrite history. You convince yourself that you are a victim when in reality you are the abuser. We have done nothing but love you and you repay us with pure malice." She was lying, of course. When I was 10, I had locked myself in my room because Evelyn had told me that my straight A report card was nothing compared to Sydney winning a spelling bee, and that I should stop trying to steal my sister's spotlight. But this was how gaslighting worked. She took my pain, twisted the context, and served it back to me as proof of my own insanity. Evelyn took another step toward me, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You have always been ungrateful," she spat. "I remember when you were in high school and you told me you wanted to start your own business one day. I told you to be realistic. I told you that you did not have the personality or the intelligence to be a leader. I told you to get a safe, boring degree in accounting so you would not end up homeless. I saved you from your own stupidity, Morgan. And this is my reward. You used the mediocre skills I pushed you to get to try and destroy the only truly successful person in this family. You are a parasite." Sydney stepped closer, her arms crossed tightly. "She is a sociopath, Mom," Sydney sneered. "Look at her. She is standing there like a robot. She does not even care that she is destroying a family. She does not care about anyone but herself. You know what your problem is, Morgan. You have spent your entire life being average. You have an average face, an average job, and an average apartment. You look at my life, and you see everything you will never have. I have a handsome, successful husband who worships the ground I walk on. I have a beautiful home. You have nothing. So instead of working hard to build your own life, you decided to try and tear mine down. You are a sad, bitter spinster, and everyone in this room knows it." Sydney laughed a harsh, grating sound. "A parasite," she agreed. "That is exactly what you are. You suck the joy out of every room you enter. You could not even let me enjoy my newly renovated kitchen without bringing your cheap grocery store cake to remind us all of how poor and pathetic you are. You wanted Spencer to thank you for bringing a $30 cake to a house that costs over $1 million. It is actually hilarious when you think about it." Spencer moved to stand right behind Sydney, placing a protective hand on her waist. He looked at me with an expression of deep disgust. "It is pathetic, really," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I came into this family and I tried to lift you all up. I tried to show you what real success looks like. I gave you access to my world, Morgan. I let you see how the other half lives, and this is how you treat me. You try to use some cheap accounting trick to freeze my business accounts, because you are threatened by a man who actually knows how to provide. You are just another angry, bitter woman who hates seeing a strong man succeed. You should be down on your knees thanking me for tolerating your presence all these years. Instead, you pull a stunt that proves exactly why you will always be at the bottom of the food chain. The sheer level of delusion was staggering. He truly believed he was the architect of the wealth that I had personally funded. He was wearing a suit bought with my money, standing in a house owned by my company, and calling me a bottom feeder. Spencer smirked, looking down at his expensive watch. I have a conference call with my actual lawyers in 15 minutes, he said dismissively. I suggest you sign the papers and get out of my house before I decide to keep the $10,000 and just sue you into the Stone Age anyway. You are wasting my valuable time. Uncle George chimed in from the love seat. You need to humble yourself, girl, he barked. You are acting like you own the world just because you learned how to mess with a computer. You are disrespecting your mother, and you are disrespecting your brother-in-law. A real woman supports her family. She does not try to tear down the man who is putting food on the table. Aunt Linda nodded vigorously. It is a spiritual sickness, she whispered loudly to the pastor. She has a demon of envy inside her. She cannot stand the light that shines from Sydney and Spencer. Pastor Thomas stood up, holding his heavy Bible. Morgan, he began, his voice echoing with religious authority. The scripture tells us to honor our father and our mother. It tells us that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. You are standing on the edge of a precipice. The devil has poisoned your heart with jealousy. If you do not take that check, sign those papers, and beg this family for forgiveness, you will be casting yourself into outer darkness. The church will not support a woman who actively plots the ruin of her own flesh and blood. You will be entirely alone in this world. They all stared at me, waiting for the breakdown. They were waiting for me to fall to my knees and cry. They wanted me to frantically apologize, to explain myself, to beg them to see my side of the story. If I argued, they would call me crazy. If I cried, they would call me weak. The only way to win their twisted game was to refuse to play it. I listened to the echoes of their toxic words fade into the high ceilings of the mansion. The audience of extended family members sat in absolute judgment, fully believing the narrative that had been fed to them. They saw a rebellious, jealous daughter standing against a loving, successful family. They did not see the strings attached to every single luxury in that room. They did not know that the very floor they were standing on belonged to the woman they were currently trying to excommunicate. I looked at Evelyn, who was staring at me with a triumphant smirk. I looked at Sydney, who was radiating smug entitlement. I looked at Spencer, who was puffing his chest out like a victorious gladiator. They had completely emptied their arsenal. They had hurled every insult, every threat, and every manipulation tactic they possessed. They were officially out of ammunition. I slowly reached out and placed my hand on the top of my briefcase, right next to the $10,000 check. The cool leather felt grounding under my fingertips. The silence stretched for another 10 seconds, making the air in the room feel incredibly thin. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a sharpened blade. Evelyn frowned, her triumphant smirk slipping just a fraction. "Excuse me," she snapped. "I asked if you are finished," I repeated, keeping my gaze locked entirely on her. "Because if you are done reciting your completely fabricated delusions, I have a few actual facts I would like to share with the group." I picked up the check and let it slip from my fingers, watching it flutter harmlessly to the floor. Then I reached for the brass clasps on my black briefcase. The time for silence was officially over. I placed my hands on the brass clasps of my briefcase. The sharp click echoed through the silent living room, sounding like a lock engaging on a prison cell. Everyone was watching me. They expected me to pull out a pen and sign the guarantor papers. They expected me to surrender. I slowly opened the leather lid and let it fall back, exposing the thick stacks of financial documents and legal filings inside. Before I could pull the first document from the stack, the heavy oak front doors of the mansion creaked open. Evelyn gasped, looking past my shoulder. The entire room shifted their attention to the grand foyer as the sound of deliberate heavy footsteps echoed against the marble floors. I did not need to turn around because I already knew exactly who had arrived. I had timed their entrance perfectly to coincide with the absolute peak of my family arrogant delusions. Two men walked into the formal living room. The first was an older gentleman dressed in a perfectly tailored dark navy suit. He carried an aura of absolute ruthlessness. This was Mr. Sterling, my personal corporate attorney. He was a senior partner at one of the most feared law firms in the country, a man who specialized in hostile takeovers and corporate dismantling. He walked with a quiet confidence, holding a sleek leather folder under his arm. Right behind him was a younger man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a simple, unbranded gray suit. He did not carry a briefcase. He did not carry any documents. He simply walked into the room with his hands resting casually at his sides, sweeping his cold, observant eyes over every single person present. His gaze lingered specifically on Spencer. This was the unidentified federal agent I had brought along as my special guest. The atmosphere in the room instantly plummeted. The smug entitlement that had filled the air just moments ago evaporated completely, leaving behind a suffocating tension. Aunt Linda gripped Uncle George's arm, looking terrified by the sudden intrusion. Pastor Thomas closed his Bible and sat up straight, his pastoral authority suddenly feeling very small in the presence of these imposing strangers. Evelyn stood up from the velvet sofa, her face flushed with fresh anger. "Who are these people?" she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling slightly. "Morgan, what is the meaning of this? You cannot just invite strangers into your sister's beautiful home without permission. This is a private family meeting. I want them out of my house right now before I call security." I left my briefcase open on the glass coffee table and turned to face my mother. "They are not strangers, Mother," I said, my voice steady and unbothered. "They are here at my specific request to help facilitate the resolution you all so desperately wanted." Spencer stepped forward, trying to puff out his chest and regain control of his living room. He looked at Mr. Sterling and let out a loud mocking laugh, trying to mask the deep uncertainty flashing in his eyes. He pointed a trembling finger at my attorney. "Let me guess," Spencer said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is the cheap strip mall lawyer you hired to try and scare me. I told you, I have a team of corporate attorneys who charge $1,000 an hour, Morgan. You bringing some discount public defender into my house is not going to save you from the lawsuit I am preparing. In fact, it just proves how deeply out of your depth you really are." Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He did not even look offended. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked at Spencer the way a scientist looks at an insect under a microscope. He did not say a word. He was paid handsomely to let me do the talking until the legal executions officially began. I smiled, looking directly at my arrogant brother-in-law. "Spencer, I would like to introduce you to my personal legal counsel," I said, gesturing gracefully toward the older man. "He does not charge $1,000 an hour. He charges that amount every 10 minutes. And his firm does not handle petty family squabbles. They handle federal corporate fraud, hostile asset acquisitions, and the total liquidation of bankrupt companies. He is here to ensure that every single move I make tonight is entirely legal and completely binding." Spencer forced another laugh, but it sounded hollow and incredibly weak. It echoed awkwardly in the silent room. "You are so full of it," he muttered, shaking his head. "You do not have the money to afford a lawyer like that. You are a low-level bookkeeper. Stop playing dress-up and get these men out of my house before I call the police and have you all arrested for trespassing." The man in the gray suit, the unidentified agent, shifted his weight slightly. He stepped further into the room and stopped right beside Mr. Sterling. He looked directly into Spencer's eyes and offered a very thin, chilling smile. "I would highly recommend against calling the local police, Spencer," the agent said, his voice low and incredibly calm. "We would hate to involve local authorities in matters that strictly fall under federal jurisdiction. It just creates unnecessary paperwork." The color drained completely from Spencer's face. His confident posture collapsed entirely as his shoulders slumped forward. The mention of federal jurisdiction hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He stared at the man in the gray suit, his mouth opening and closing, as his brain struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the nightmare he had just woken up in. Sydney rushed to her husband's side, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. She looked wildly between me and the two men. "Spencer, what is he talking about?" She practically screamed, her voice laced with absolute terror. "Why is he talking about federal jurisdiction? Morgan, what did you do? What kind of lies did you tell these people?" Evelyn rushed forward, positioning herself between Sydney and the men. She raised her hand, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You are sick, Morgan!" She shrieked, her carefully maintained church persona shattering completely. "You hired actors to come in here and threaten us. You are trying to terrorize your own family just because we asked you to take responsibility for your childish actions. Pastor, please tell them they need to leave. This is a house of God and they are trespassing." Pastor Thomas remained completely silent. He was a man who understood power dynamics, and he clearly recognized that the true power in this room had just shifted entirely. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, refusing to intervene. Uncle George stood up from the love seat, his face pale. "Morgan," he said, his voice lacking all of its previous aggressive bravado, "you are crossing a very dangerous line right now. You need to stop this before someone actually gets hurt." I turned my back on them and looked down at my open briefcase. I was not crossing a line. I was erasing the line entirely and drawing a brand new one. They had spent the last hour demanding that I open my laptop and show them my banking portal. They wanted me to prove my compliance. Now I was going to show them my actual world. I reached into the leather interior of the black briefcase and pulled out the first thick stack of documents. The heavy paper felt incredible in my hands. The room was so quiet that the simple sound of the pages rustling sounded like thunder. I turned around to face my family, the people who had bullied, minimized, and abused me for my entire existence. I looked at the $10,000 check lying forgotten on the marble floor. "I think it is time we discuss the exact nature of Spencer corporate success," I announced, my voice echoing with final authority. "And since Sydney is so deeply concerned about her beautiful home, I think we should start with the property deed." Mr. Sterling stepped forward, opening his leather folder. The man in the gray suit simply crossed his arms and watched. The true reckoning had officially arrived. Mr. Sterling pulled a thick, heavy document from his leather folder and handed it to me. I took the heavy parchment paper, feeling the raised seal of the county clerk under my thumb. I dropped it directly onto the glass coffee table, right on top of the pathetic $10,000 check Sydney had thrown at me. The sound was sharp and commanding, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. I looked at Sydney, who was staring at the paper with a mixture of deep confusion and mounting dread. I told Sydney that she loved to remind everyone that she lived in a multi-million-dollar mansion. I told her she loved to post photos of the grand staircase and the imported Italian marble floors, acting like she was the absolute queen of suburban royalty. I told her to pick up the paper and read the name of the current legal owner. Sydney did not move. She looked at Spencer, who was suddenly sweating profusely. His face had gone completely pale, and he was staring at the document like it was a live explosive. When neither of them reached for it, Evelyn stepped forward. My mother snatched the document off the table, her eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. She squinted, reading the bold print at the very top of the page. Evelyn read the name aloud. She said M&J Holdings LLC. She looked up at me completely bewildered and asked what that meant. She asked what this random corporate entity had to do with the beautiful house that belonged to Sydney and Spencer. I smiled, taking a slow, deliberate breath. I told my mother that M&J Holdings was a private corporate subsidiary of the equity firm that I had built from the ground up. I told her that I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of that firm. I let that information hang in the air for a long moment, watching the absolute shock wash over the faces of my family. Then I explained the timeline so they could fully understand the depth of the illusion they had been living in. I told them that Spencer did indeed buy the house 5 years ago, using my pristine credit as a crutch to secure the initial massive mortgage. But what he completely failed to mention to his beautiful wife and his adoring mother-in-law was that he stopped making those mortgage payments exactly 4 years ago. He was taking the money he was supposed to be paying to the bank and funneling it into his failing logistics company just to keep the lights on and maintain his fake executive lifestyle. I explained that banks do not care about your country club memberships or your expensive tailored suits. When you do not pay them, they take their property back. I told the room that the bank had quietly initiated foreclosure proceedings against Spencer over a year ago. He had been hiding the default notices from Sydney, hoping he could pull off a financial miracle before the bank finally seized the estate. But there was no miracle, because he was a terrible businessman. The bank fully foreclosed on the property and put it up for a private commercial auction. And that is exactly where I stepped in. I told them, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the formal living room. I told them my private equity firm purchased the foreclosed deed in cash. We paid off the outstanding debt and took immediate legal possession of the entire estate. I looked directly at Sydney and told her that she was not a wealthy, sophisticated homeowner. She was a squatter living rent-free in a house that belonged entirely to the sister she had just tried to banish. Sydney let out a breathless gasp, shaking her head violently, as if the physical motion could erase my words. She turned to Spencer, grabbing the lapels of his expensive jacket. She demanded that he tell them I was lying. She begged him to say that the house was still theirs, and that he had not lost their perfect suburban dream home. Spencer could not even look her in the eye. He stared at the marble floor, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter under the pressure. His absolute silence was the loudest confession anyone could have ever made. Evelyn dropped the deed back onto the coffee table as if the paper had physically burned her fingers. She stumbled backward, collapsing onto the plush velvet sofa. Her hands covered her mouth, and she stared at Spencer with absolute horror. The golden son-in-law, the man she had placed on a pedestal high above her own flesh and blood, had secretly lost the very roof over their heads. I looked at Uncle George, who had been so quick to condemn me just moments earlier. I asked him if he still thought I needed to humble myself. I asked Aunt Linda if she still thought I had a demon of envy inside me. I told them they had all come into my house sitting on furniture my money had likely paid for, and had the absolute audacity to judge my character based on the lies of a desperate con man. They did not say a single word. They looked utterly humiliated, their self-righteous anger completely extinguished by the cold, hard evidence sitting on the table. But I was not finished. I turned back to Mr. Sterling and held out my hand. He reached into his leather folder and retrieved a single crisp sheet of paper, handing it to me. It was much thinner than the property deed, but it carried infinitely more immediate consequences. I took the paper and walked around the glass coffee table, stopping right in front of Sydney. She shrank back, pressing herself against Spencer, but there was nowhere for her to hide. I held the paper out toward her. When she refused to take it, I simply let it fall from my fingers, watching it flutter down to land directly on the toe of her designer shoe. I told her that was an official legal notice of eviction. I explained that since my company was the legal owner of the property, and we had no formal lease agreement with the current occupants, they were legally classified as holdover tenants. I told her that because she had decided to throw my birthday cake on my beautiful marble floor, I had decided not to renew their undocumented tenancy. The eviction notice gave them exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises completely. 48 hours, I repeated, letting the words sink deep into her panicked mind. I told her that by Thursday evening I expected every piece of designer furniture, every expensive dress, and every trace of her toxic existence to be gone from my property. If they were not gone, my attorney would have the local sheriff arrive on Friday morning to physically remove them and dump their belongings onto the front lawn for the entire wealthy neighborhood to see. Sydney began to hyperventilate. The crushing reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. She had spent the entire afternoon throwing a massive tantrum at a Chanel boutique because her card was declined, and now she was being legally thrown out onto the street by the sister she despised. She looked around the room searching for someone to save her. She looked at Evelyn, but my mother was too paralyzed by shock to speak. She looked at Pastor Thomas, but the clergyman kept his eyes firmly averted, refusing to intervene in a legal property dispute. Spencer finally found his voice, though it was completely stripped of its former arrogant boom. He pleaded with me, saying we could work something out privately. He said he just needed a little more time to liquidate some assets, and he could buy the house back from my firm with interest. He begged me not to do this to Sydney, not to throw his wife out of her home. I told Spencer that his sudden concern for his wife was incredibly touching, but ultimately entirely useless. I reminded him that he was the one who threatened to have his expensive lawyers crush me into the Stone Age just 10 minutes ago. I asked him why he was begging a low-level bookkeeper for mercy when he had so much power and influence in the city. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously to the man in the gray suit who was still watching his every move in absolute silence. The humiliation in the room was absolute, but the true nightmare for Spencer was only just beginning. Sydney stared at the eviction notice resting on the toe of her designer shoe, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She refused to bend down and pick it up. Her chest was heaving with quick, shallow breaths, and her perfectly manicured hands were trembling visibly. She slowly lifted her head and turned her desperate gaze toward Spencer. She grabbed his arm, her perfectly polished acrylic nails digging deep into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. She demanded that he tell everyone this was a sick joke. She told him to pull out his phone and call his high-priced corporate lawyers right this second. She wanted him to prove that the house was still theirs, and that I was just a jealous, bitter woman trying to play a cruel trick on them. Spencer did not reach for his phone. He did not puff out his chest or issue any more legal threats. He was sweating profusely, the moisture gathering on his forehead and soaking the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. His eyes darted frantically around the room, refusing to make eye contact with his wife, his mother-in-law, or the federal agent standing just a few feet away. He swallowed hard and stammered out a weak, pathetic excuse. He told Sydney that there must have been a clerical error at the bank. He mumbled something about a missed transfer and a miscommunication with the mortgage broker. He tried to say that the corporate accounts were just tangled up and that he would fix it first thing in the morning once the banks opened. But Sydney was shallow, not stupid. She had lived with this man for 5 years, and she knew the difference between his confident business voice and his desperate lying voice. She let go of his arm and took a step back, her expression twisting from terror into absolute rage. She asked him what he meant by a clerical error. She demanded to know how a bank could accidentally foreclose on a multi-million-dollar property and sell it to an equity firm without him noticing. She raised her voice asking where all the money had gone. She brought up the massive bonuses he claimed to have received last quarter and the phantom family trust fund he had promised her. She demanded to know why the mortgage had not been paid in 4 years. The sheer pressure of her rapid-fire demands, combined with the presence of federal law enforcement, finally caused Spencer to snap. The polite, wealthy country club husband completely vanished, leaving behind a cornered, desperate man. He turned on his wife with a vicious snarl, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson. He yelled at her to shut her mouth. He told her that there was no money because she had spent every single dime trying to play the role of a wealthy socialite. He blamed her for the financial collapse, pointing a shaking finger directly in her face. He said she was a black hole of consumer debt, constantly demanding new imported cars, luxury vacations, and endless renovations to a house they could not even afford. He told her that while he was drowning in corporate debt trying to keep his company afloat, she was out dropping tens of thousands of dollars on Chanel bags and charity galas just to impress a bunch of bored suburban housewives. Sydney recoiled, as if he had physically struck her. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as the man she had worshipped and paraded around as the ultimate prize suddenly blamed her for his total failure. She did not cower, though. The toxic family dynamic that Evelyn had instilled in us meant that Sydney knew exactly how to fight dirty. She screamed right back at him, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the living room she was about to lose. She told him he was a pathetic excuse for a man. She reminded him that he was the one who insisted on the expensive lifestyle because he desperately needed to look successful to his white peers. She said he used her as a beautiful prop to convince his investors that he was a stable, wealthy executive. She called him a fraud and a liar, telling him he was nothing before he married into our family and used my credit to fund his pathetic little startup. The argument escalated violently, transforming the elegant formal living room into a battleground of shattered egos and buried resentments. They were tearing each other apart completely, forgetting about the eviction notice, my attorney, or the federal agent watching their every move. Evelyn sat paralyzed on the velvet sofa, watching the perfect golden marriage she had worshipped completely implode in front of her eyes. Uncle George and Aunt Linda stared at the floor, deeply uncomfortable and entirely silent. They had come to witness my humiliation, and instead they were getting a front-row seat to the absolute destruction of the family favorite. Spencer tried to shout over Sydney, but his voice was cracking with panic. He told her she was a gold digger who had brought absolutely zero gold to the table. He said he had ruined his life trying to provide for a spoiled, entitled princess who contributed nothing to the marriage but credit card bills and constant complaints. Sydney shrieked, calling him a fake millionaire who was too weak to even keep a roof over her head. She told him she wished she had never met him and that he had completely ruined her life. I stood quietly beside Mr. Sterling and simply watched them destroy each other. I did not need to say a single word. The internal conflict was doing all the heavy lifting for me. Every insult they hurled at each other was a direct confirmation of everything I had known for years. Their entire relationship was built on a foundation of lies, financial abuse, and mutual manipulation. As soon as the money dried up, the love evaporated instantly, revealing the pure toxic hatred underneath. The man in the gray suit pulled a small notebook from his pocket and quietly jotted down a few notes. Spencer's frantic admission that he had been hiding corporate debt and commingling funds to pay for his wife's luxury lifestyle was essentially a verbal confession to financial fraud. Spencer was so busy trying to win a screaming match with his wife that he did not even realize he was giving a federal investigator everything needed to secure a conviction. Sydney finally broke down into loud, ugly sobs, realizing that all the screaming in the world would not change the fact that the eviction notice was real. She was entirely broke, married to a fraud, and about to be homeless. She fell to her knees, right there on the imported marble floor, crying hysterically, while her husband stood over her, breathing heavily and refusing to offer her a single ounce of comfort. The perfect couple was officially broken, and the room was filled with the bitter stench of their collective failure. I watched Sydney sobbing on the marble floor for another moment before I decided it was time to deliver the absolute final blow. The eviction was merely the warm-up, meant to strip them of their physical sanctuary. Now it was time to strip them of their freedom and their future. I turned back to Mr. Sterling and held out my hand once again. He did not hesitate. He reached into his premium leather folder and pulled out a thick bound stack of heavy papers. The document had a prominent red federal seal stamped directly on the front page. He placed it into my waiting hand. The room was still echoing with the pathetic sounds of Sydney crying, but the heavy thud of this new document hitting the glass coffee table forced every single person to fall completely silent once more. I looked at Spencer, who was staring at the red seal, as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. I told the room that they were looking at a formal suspicious activity report. I explained that in the ruthless world of high finance, we call it a SAR. It is a highly confidential document filed by financial institutions when they detect massive organized fraud and money laundering. I told Spencer that my team of forensic accountants had been secretly compiling this specific report for the last 6 months. I told him we had officially submitted it to the federal authorities early this morning, right after I removed my financial backing from his accounts. I looked over at my Aunt Linda and Uncle George, who were sitting on the love seat completely frozen in terror. I asked them if they actually knew what Spencer Logistics Company did for a living. I did not wait for them to answer. I answered the question for them. I told them the company did absolutely nothing. I said it was a ghost operation, a completely hollow shell company built entirely on lies. I explained that Spencer had no physical shipping fleet, no warehouses, and no real corporate clients. He was generating fake invoices and forging commercial freight contracts to secure massive business loans from unsuspecting banks. He was taking the new loan money to pay off his old loan interest while aggressively skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars off the top to pay for Sydney designer wardrobe and his luxury vehicles. I told the room it was a classic textbook Ponzi scheme and it was completely unraveling in real time. Spencer tried to open his mouth to deny the allegations, but his throat was so dry that no sound came out. He looked like a drowning man gasping for air. The man in the gray suit. The federal agent simply tilted his head and watched Spencer sweat. I told Spencer that the agent standing in his living room was not here to arrest him for simple trespassing. I said the agent was here to verify the physical evidence of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. Then I turned my attention away from the pathetic broken man and focused entirely on Evelyn. My mother was still sitting frozen on the velvet sofa, her eyes wide and unblinking. She looked like a woman who had just survived a massive catastrophic accident, but she did not even know the worst part yet. I walked slowly around the coffee table and stood directly in front of her. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless. I asked my mother how she thought Spencer had managed to keep his fake company afloat for the last 8 months after his final bank loan had dried up. Evelyn just stared at me, her lips trembling slightly. She shook her head, unable to form a single coherent word. I told her that desperate men do terrible things when they are cornered and facing federal prison. I asked her if she remembered signing a thick stack of legal documents last Thanksgiving, right before we ate dinner. I reminded her that Spencer had told her it was just standard administrative paperwork to help manage her investment portfolio and protect her assets from capital gains taxes. I asked her if she had actually read a single page of what she had signed before handing the pen back to him. The color completely drained from Evelyn's face, leaving her looking gray and incredibly old. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as she grabbed the fabric of her expensive emerald skirt. I told her that she had blindly signed over full legal power of attorney to a desperate fraudster. I told her she did it because she trusted the color of his skin and his expensive tailored suits far more than she ever trusted her own daughter. I told her that Spencer used that absolute power of attorney to quietly mortgage her entire retirement fund. I let those words hang in the silent room. I told her that Spencer liquidated her entire pension. He completely drained her high-yield savings accounts, and he took out massive lines of credit against her personal assets, just to desperately plug the holes in his sinking corporate ship. I told her he took everything she had spent 40 years building, and he fed it directly into his fake company, where it vanished into thin air. Evelyn let out a horrific, gut-wrenching wail. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the glass coffee table to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. She turned to Spencer, her eyes wide with absolute sheer panic. She screamed his name, demanding that he tell her I was lying. She begged him to tell her that her money was safe in the bank and that he would never steal from his own mother-in-law. Spencer simply looked away, staring blankly at the wall, unable to meet her gaze. Pastor Thomas stood up from his chair, his heavy Bible nearly slipping from his grasp. He stared at Spencer with a look of profound disgust, realizing that the massive tithes Spencer had been giving to the church were actually funded by stolen money and fraudulent loans. The pastor slowly backed away toward the hallway, distancing himself from the sheer toxicity of the crime. Uncle George stood up, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He looked at Spencer as if he wanted to physically attack him, but the presence of the federal agent kept him rooted in place. Aunt Linda started crying quietly into her hands, realizing that the family matriarch was now completely penniless. I looked back at Evelyn, who was rocking back and forth on the velvet sofa, repeating the word no over and over again in a broken whisper. She had built her entire identity on being the wealthy, respected pillar of the community. She loved to look down on people who struggled financially. She loved to tell everyone that her family was blessed by God because they were so much better than everyone else. Now she was facing the brutal reality that she would likely have to file for extreme bankruptcy and live off meager government assistance for the rest of her life. I looked my mother dead in the eyes and delivered the absolute, unvarnished truth. I told her that every single penny she had saved for her entire life was completely gone. I told her she was completely broke and utterly destitute. I reminded her that just 10 minutes ago, she had threatened to destroy my life and banish me from the family because I refused to blindly support this man. I told her she had sacrificed her actual daughter to protect a parasite who had secretly stolen her entire future. I told Evelyn that she could keep the $10,000 check Sydney had thrown at me. I told her she was going to need every single cent to hire a bankruptcy lawyer and find a cheap apartment before the sheriff arrived on Friday morning to lock the doors of this mansion forever. The Golden family was officially bankrupt in every possible way, and the devastating silence in the room proved that they finally understood exactly what they had done. The devastating silence in the room was finally broken by the quiet, deliberate movement of the man in the gray suit. He stepped away from his position near the grand entryway and walked directly toward the center of the living room. The air seemed to grow colder with every step he took. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a heavy gold badge, flipping it open for Spencer to see. He introduced himself as Special Agent Harrison with the Federal Bureau of Investigation White Collar Crimes Division. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion or sympathy. It was the voice of the man who spent his entire career dismantling the lives of arrogant men who thought they were smarter than the federal government. Agent Harrison calmly explained that he had a federal warrant for the immediate arrest of Spencer on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He reached around to the back of his belt, and the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs being unlatched echoed through the room. It was the loudest sound in the world. Spencer physically recoiled, taking a step backward until his legs hit the edge of the velvet sofa. He raised his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender, his entire body shaking violently. His pristine white savior image, the confident corporate titan persona that my family had worshipped for half a decade, shattered into a million pathetic pieces right in front of their eyes. "Wait, please, you do not understand," Spencer stammered, his voice pitching up into a breathless whine. "I can explain everything, and I have assets I can liquidate. I can make the banks whole by the end of the month. You do not need to do this in front of my family. I am a respected businessman in this community." Agent Harrison did not pause. He grabbed Spencer by the arm, with a practiced, terrifying efficiency, spinning him around and forcing his hands behind his back. The steel cuffs clamped down onto Spencer's wrists with a heavy finality. The sound made my Aunt Linda let out a sharp, terrified gasp. Spencer let out a pathetic sob as the cold metal bit into his skin. He realized that his country club memberships and his tailored suits meant absolutely nothing to the federal justice system. He was cornered, and his absolute cowardice completely took over. He twisted his neck, trying to look back at the federal agent. "It was not me," he yelled, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "I did not want to do any of this. It was her." He violently jerked his head in the direction of his sobbing wife. "It was Sydney. She forced me to do it. She told me she would divorce me and take everything if I did not give her a multi-million-dollar lifestyle. She is the one who spent all the stolen money. She bought imported cars and designer clothes and took luxury vacations while I was suffering trying to keep the business alive. She knew the money was dirty. She knew it, and she did not care. You need to arrest her too. She is an accomplice." The entire room gasped in collective horror. The ultimate golden couple, the suburban royalty that my mother had held over my head for my entire adult life, had devolved into a pair of cornered rats turning on each other to survive. Sydney stopped crying instantly, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged at her handcuffed husband, her manicured hands curled into claws. "You lying piece of garbage!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs. "You told me you were a millionaire when I met you. You lied to me every single day of our marriage. You stole my mother retirement money, and now you are trying to send me to federal prison to save your own pathetic skin. I hope you rot in a cell for the rest of your miserable life." Agent Harrison easily blocked Sydney from reaching Spencer, pushing her back with a firm, authoritative hand. He read Spencer his Miranda rights in a steady, monotonous voice, completely ignoring the domestic meltdown happening around him. When he finished, he grabbed Spencer by the bicep and began marching him toward the heavy oak front doors. Spencer looked back at the room one last time, his eyes searching for anyone to save him. He looked at Uncle George, who turned his head away in deep disgust. He looked at Pastor Thomas, who closed his eyes and began silently praying. And finally he looked at me. I did not smile. I simply stared back at him with absolute indifference, watching the man who had tormented me for years be led away in total disgrace. The heavy front doors slammed shut behind the federal agent and his prisoner. The echoing boom shook the walls of the mansion, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating quiet. Sydney stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving, her makeup completely smeared down her face, ruining her expensive silk dress. She looked around the luxurious living room, suddenly realizing that nothing she saw belonged to her. The chandeliers, the furniture, the marble floors. It was all the property of the sister she had treated like dirt. She let out a hollow, broken sound and ran out of the room, fleeing up the grand staircase to hide in a bedroom she would legally have to vacate in less than 48 hours. With Spencer gone and Sydney retreating, the brutal reality of the situation finally landed squarely on the shoulders of the woman who had orchestrated this entire toxic family dynamic. Evelyn let out a low, agonizing moan that sounded like an animal caught in a trap. Her legs finally gave out completely. The proud matriarch of the church, the woman who had demanded respect and absolute obedience from everyone around her, collapsed off the velvet sofa and hit the floor. She crawled across the imported Italian marble, the same marble she had demanded I clean my birthday cake off of just 24 hours prior. She dragged herself toward me, her expensive emerald suit wrinkling against the hard stone. She reached out with trembling hands, wrapping her fingers around the hem of my perfectly tailored trousers. "Morgan," she wept, her voice entirely stripped of its former arrogance. "Morgan, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, please, please, you have to help me. You are the only one who can fix this. You are so smart and so powerful. You can buy back my retirement fund. You have millions of dollars. You can let me stay in this house. I am your mother, Morgan. I gave you life. You cannot let me live on the street. God would never forgive you for abandoning your own mother in her darkest hour." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. For 30 years I had craved her affection. I had twisted myself into knots trying to earn a single word of the praise she showered so freely on my sister and my brother-in-law. I had funded their lives, paid their debts, and swallowed their insults just to keep a seat at a table that was inherently designed to exclude me. But looking at her now begging for the wealth she had mocked me for supposedly not having, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional chains she had wrapped around my throat since childhood simply snapped and dissolved into dust. I slowly reached down and firmly peeled her trembling fingers off my trousers. I stepped back, putting physical distance between myself and her toxic presence. I looked her directly in the eyes, ensuring she would remember every single word I was about to say for the rest of her bankrupt life. "Do not call me your daughter," I said, my voice echoing cold and clear in the massive room. "You made your choice, Evelyn. You chose the aesthetic of wealth over the reality of love. You chose a white con man in a tailored suit over your own flesh and blood because you were so desperate to impress a community of people who do not even care about you. You fed me to the wolves every single day of my life to protect Sydney, and now the wolves have come to collect your entire future. Evelyn sobbed harder, pressing her forehead against the cold marble floor. But I am family, she wailed, hitting the stone with her fists. You cannot do this to family. I picked up my heavy black briefcase from the glass coffee table, securing the brass clasps with a sharp click. Mr. Sterling quietly closed his leather folder, standing respectfully by my side. I looked down at my mother one last time. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen, opening the message thread from the night before. I read her own words back to her. "We are done. You are not part of this family," I recited, perfectly matching the cruel tone she had used for decades. "I simply took your advice, Mother. I removed my name from everything. You wanted to banish the dark cloud from your perfect life. Well, the cloud is officially gone, and now you get to burn in the sun you created. Good luck finding an apartment on your church salary. You have 48 hours to get off my property." I turned my back on the woman who gave birth to me and walked steadily toward the grand entryway. Uncle George, Aunt Linda, and Pastor Thomas watched me leave completely silent, too terrified by my absolute ruthlessness to say a single word. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the crisp evening air. My black town car was waiting patiently at the curb, the engine purring softly. My driver opened the door for me, and I slid into the luxurious leather-back seat. As the car pulled away from the sprawling estate, I did not look back at the mansion. I did not look back at the wreckage of the family that had tried to destroy me. I simply looked forward to a future that was entirely my own, built on a foundation of absolute truth and undeniable power. 2 months have passed since that crisp evening when I walked out of my own mansion and left my family to face the devastating consequences of their own actions. The federal justice system moves with a terrifying speed when there is a mountain of undeniable financial evidence handed to them on a silver platter. Spencer was denied bail at his initial hearing. The judge deemed him an extreme flight risk after federal prosecutors revealed that he had been secretly attempting to wire whatever remaining stolen funds he had into offshore accounts just days before his arrest. He has been sitting in a sterile concrete cell ever since trading his custom-tailored Italian suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His expensive corporate legal team dropped him the moment they realized his accounts were permanently frozen and he could not pay their exorbitant retainer fees. He is currently represented by an overworked public defender who has already advised him to take a plea deal. He is facing 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering, and the prosecutors are not showing him a single ounce of mercy. The logistics company he claimed to be the CEO of was completely dissolved by the state. My private equity firm swept in and legally purchased the few legitimate logistical assets he possessed for pennies on the dollar, completely wiping his name from the corporate map forever. The empire he thought he built was nothing more than a mirage, and now he has decades behind bars to think about how he treated the people who secretly funded his luxurious life. Sydney life unraveled even faster than her husband's criminal enterprise. Exactly 48 hours after our family meeting, Mr. Sterling made good on his promise. Sydney refused to leave the mansion, believing right up until the very last second that she could manipulate her way out of the eviction. She thought her tears would somehow stop a legal mandate, just like they always stopped our mother from holding her accountable. On Friday morning, the county sheriff arrived with a professional moving crew. They physically escorted Sydney off the property while the crew packed up her designer clothes and her expensive furniture, dumping it all directly onto the manicured front lawn, just as the wealthy neighbors were leaving for their morning golf games. She suffered the ultimate public humiliation, standing on the sidewalk weeping as the people she had spent years trying to impress drove by and stared at her in absolute pity and disgust. With all of her credit cards permanently deactivated and her husband locked in a federal holding facility, Sydney had absolutely nowhere to go. She had to pawn her diamond wedding ring just to afford the security deposit on a terrible apartment. She is currently living in a rundown one-bedroom unit in a heavily industrialized part of the city. The walls are thin, the plumbing constantly leaks, and the imported marble floors she loved so much have been replaced by peeling linoleum. To pay her rent and her mounting legal fees for her messy divorce, she was forced to take a minimum wage job working the cash register at a discount department store. The absolute irony of her having to fold cheap clothes for irritable customers after she spent years mocking my career is a form of poetic justice that I could have never scripted better myself. She spends her days getting yelled at by strangers for expired coupons. She tried to keep up appearances on social media for a while, but everyone in our hometown already knew the truth. The comments on her photos were filled with people asking about the foreclosure and her husband's criminal trial, so she had to delete all her accounts entirely, hiding from the world she used to rule. She tries to call me sometimes, leaving desperate voicemails, begging for a second chance, crying about how hard her life has become. But my phone automatically routes her number straight to the trash folder where she belongs. And then there is Evelyn, the mighty matriarch who built her entire existence on religious superiority and toxic control. Her downfall was perhaps the most spectacular of them all because it attacked the one thing she valued above all else, which was her public image. The news of Spencer's federal indictment and the massive fraud he committed spread through her precious church community like a wildfire. Pastor Thomas, the man who sat in the living room and watched my mother sacrifice me to save a criminal, did exactly what cowards always do when their public reputation is threatened. He completely distanced himself and the church from Evelyn. He stood at the pulpit on a Sunday morning and delivered a passionate sermon about the evils of greed and the dangers of false idols, heavily implying that Evelyn was spiritually corrupt for allowing such massive financial sins to occur under her own roof. The congregation that she had spent decades trying to impress instantly turned their backs on her. The ladies who used to invite her to elite prayer luncheons suddenly stopped answering her phone calls. She was completely shunned by the only community she had ever valued. Because Spencer had stolen and liquidated her entire retirement fund, Evelyn was forced to declare total bankruptcy. The bank repossessed her modest car, and she had to move into a tiny subsidized housing unit for low-income seniors on the outskirts of the city. She tried to reach out to Uncle George and Aunt Linda for financial support, but they quickly blocked her number, not wanting to be dragged into a federal investigation or a messy bankruptcy proceeding. The family loyalty she preached about her entire life turned out to be completely conditional, based on how much money she could throw around. She spends her days entirely alone, sitting in a cramped living room, surrounded by the cheap remnants of a life she destroyed with her own hands. She has no money, no church community, no golden son-in-law, and no daughters who will speak to her. She built a fortress of lies and manipulation, and now she is the only prisoner left inside of it. As for me, I am sitting in my penthouse office looking out over the magnificent skyline of Chicago. My private equity firm just closed its most profitable quarter in the history of the company. We are expanding our operations internationally, and my net worth continues to climb in complete silence. But the money is not the most valuable thing I gained from this entire ordeal. The true wealth I possess now is the absolute, untouchable peace that fills my life every single day. I wake up in the morning and I do not feel the heavy, suffocating weight of my mother expectations. I do not brace myself for the cruel, condescending remarks of a jealous sister. I do not have to shrink myself, dim my own light, or pretend to be small just to make toxic, insecure people feel comfortable in my presence. I am completely free from the emotional prison they kept me in for 30 years. For years, I believed the lie that blood dictates loyalty. I believed that because we shared the same last name, I owed them my resources, my sanity, and my endless forgiveness. We are conditioned by society to protect our family at all costs, even when that family is actively trying to destroy us. We are told to turn the other cheek, to keep the peace, to swallow our pride and endure the abuse, because that is just what family does. But I am here to tell you that this is the most dangerous lie you will ever be taught. Biology is nothing more than a coincidence of birth. It does not give anyone the right to abuse you, disrespect you, or use you as a stepping stone for their own massive ego. Respect is earned, and love is demonstrated through consistent actions, not empty titles. If a stranger treated you the way your toxic family members do, you would call the police and never speak to them again. You should not lower your standards just because someone shares your DNA. Cutting off my family was the most painful decision I ever had to make, but it was also the single act that saved my life. Learning to love yourself after a lifetime of emotional abuse is a slow and deliberate process. You have to unlearn every single insult they ever threw at you. You have to look in the mirror and realize that their inability to love you was a reflection of their own brokenness, not a measure of your worth. When you finally remove the toxic weeds from your garden, you will be absolutely amazed at how quickly you begin to bloom. I have spent the last 2 months cultivating a chosen family, a circle of brilliant, supportive, and genuinely kind friends and colleagues who celebrate my victories instead of plotting my downfall. They do not ask me for money, they do not try to publicly humiliate me, and they do not view my success as a threat to their own existence. They love me for exactly who I am, and for the first time in my life, I feel completely seen and entirely safe. We spend holidays together laughing and creating memories that are not tainted by passive-aggressive comments or hidden agendas. You are not required to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. You are not obligated to sit at a table where you are the main course. If someone consistently treats you like you are completely worthless, no matter how much you try to prove your value, it is time to stop trying to convince them. It is time to pack up your worth and walk out the door. The moment you stop seeking validation from people who are deeply committed to misunderstanding you is the moment you reclaim your absolute power. Sometimes the universe forces you into a corner so you can finally realize that you had the strength to break the walls down all along. My family thought they were banishing a weak, pathetic accountant to the shadows. They did not realize they were simply clearing the stage for the CEO to finally take her rightful place. I want to thank you for listening to my story today. It is not easy to share these dark chapters of our lives, but there is a profound healing in bringing the truth out into the light. If you are currently sitting in a room feeling small, unloved, and unappreciated by the people who are supposed to protect you, I need you to know that your current situation is not your final destination. You have the power to rewrite the script of your life at any given moment. You have the power to walk away from the table. I would love to hear your own stories of resilience and courage. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to save yourself? How did you find the strength to set those boundaries and walk away? Please share your experiences in the comments below, because your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today to finally break their own chains. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to build a community of strong, independent people who refuse to be victims. Remember to always know your worth, demand respect, and never apologize for protecting your peace. I will see you in the next video.